My name is Michael Guyette, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Natalie Brunell. So Natalie, I know you've built a hell of a name and brand over the last several years here, but introduce yourself to the audience. Who are you? How'd you get involved and interested in the Bitcoin and crypto space? And what are you doing with your pod?
Awesome. Thanks so much. And I hope you feel better. Yeah, my name is Natalie Brunell. I host a show called Coin Stories. I also host a second show as of recently called Hard Money. And basically, I focus on educating the general audience about Bitcoin and how it fits into the greater picture of, the current financial system and investing at large. I became interested in Bitcoin while I was a mainstream journalist. I worked in television for more than 10 years. I was a breaking news correspondent and an investigative journalist. I worked all over the country. And I learned about Bitcoin actually for the first time back in 2017. And I really relate to people who kind of are on the outside of this space looking in, very curious, but they don't know really where to start and are maybe skeptical of investing their money. Because when I first learned about it, I thought that Bitcoin was like a stock and that there was a lot of inherent risk in it, that I could potentially lose all my money if I put it into it, because I thought since it's digital, it could get hacked or eventually it could fail. And I was given the book, The Bitcoin Standard, by a mentor of mine in 2019. So I actually purchased a little bit of Bitcoin back in 2017. I covered a couple of Bitcoin stories as a journalist. And then I really went down the rabbit hole after someone gave me the book, The Bitcoin Standard, which I always recommend as one of my favorite books in the space, because that book really, I think, lifted the veil from my eyes and made me question what money is and how our current financial system works, which I think we take for granted. We use money every single day and we see prices around us going up, but we don't really question what is money and who's in charge of making the money and who gets first access to money and why the system works the way that it does. And so I really started to study. And then I started this show more as a passion project because I felt like I was becoming exposed to so many things I never really understood, this sort of intersection of technology, finance, philosophy, politics. And I started the show and it turned into my career. I basically left my job as a journalist to focus specifically on this space. And I've been super grateful to work in it and really learn as much as I can from people from all walks of life who have decided that, Bitcoin is potentially a technological tool to solve some of the financial issues that we have both here in the US and around the globe. And so that might be a little bit of a tangent, but I think that Bitcoin is the most perfectly engineered and most ethical form of money that's ever been invented. And so I'm very, very passionate about discussing ways that I think adoption will grow.
Are all of your guests focused purely on Bitcoin, or is there a broader focus on blockchain and crypto?
My guests range from really big Bitcoin proponents and strong voices in the space to people who are against it and don't believe in it at all. So it's really a range. And my podcast at first focused on people that were all advocates, but I think it's important to bring in people that are critics or see things a different way or are still questioning, because it makes our arguments stronger to face that criticism and to understand what are the threats and what are some of the vulnerabilities to the network. So I've had a range of guests, and I really focus not just on Bitcoin, but about macroeconomics and the problems that are facing, especially Americans, with inflation over the last 2 years as a result of the stimulus response to the pandemic and all of that. So I try to bridge those two worlds, because right now, if you turn on the CNBCs and the traditional, finance channels, it doesn't, in my opinion, feel like they're very, very educated in Bitcoin and how the network works and really the programming and the computer science behind it. And sometimes they almost leapfrog over that and questioning why this ecosystem even exists and what problem it's trying to solve. They leapfrog over to all of the shiny, things that are happening in the space, and they end up interviewing people that are running Ponzi schemes and calling them the next Warren Buffett. And so I want to be sort of that entry point where people are curious and they want to learn and really more focused on the first principles and fundamentals and what's wrong, the problem in our current system, and how Bitcoin is a tool that potentially fixes it.
Okay, so actually, and obviously you're alluding to SBF there, but so I think this is an interesting challenge when you're interviewing others, which is that the truth is you never really know who you're interviewing. You can look up things online. You might hear about reputations, but how many people interviewed Madoff? How many people interviewed Epstein, right? And interviewed a lot of people like that. So I myself, do this as a solo effort. I don't know. I don't know if it's you or if it's with a team, but how do you go about vetting to make sure that somebody actually is legitimate, isn't like that? You can't fully vet out fully those people that would be guests, but you got to be careful that you're not interviewing somebody who might be a legitimate psychopath.
Right. And I think that the ethos of Bitcoin is very important here, right? Don't trust, verify. And I think that right now, the space at large is so interesting because I don't believe in having heroes. I mean, a lot of people make Elon Musk right now into a hero that's going to come in and save Twitter. Well, maybe not. I mean, how do you really know a person's true intentions? And I think that it's really healthy to have that sort of critical mind and skeptical mind to say, well, they're telling me this, but I don't necessarily know. And when it comes to putting your money in a place, that's really the whole purpose of why we're so passionate about decentralization when Bitcoiners talk about it, is because we don't want to have to trust a centralized ledger or a company. And I'm probably one of the most skeptical people for two reasons. Number one, my journalism background. I was an investigative journalist, and some of the biggest stories that I ever broke or covered had to do with corruption. People that, appeared one way and they were doing shady things in the background, which we see on a daily basis. And, fraud is pretty much all around us. But then secondly, also just my personal background. My family grew up under communism. They don't trust the government. So I naturally was kind of, I think, predisposed to appreciating the principles that Bitcoin stands for in terms of just individual sovereignty, trusting yourself, not other people, and not a system of control that may take away your freedoms if they have the opportunity to. So for me, I don't trust. I try to verify as much as I can with an open mind. And sometimes when people make mistakes, though, I think it's important to kind of own those mistakes. And that's something none of our politicians and leaders want to do. But I do think it's important for people to be very, very careful, especially in a space that's very, very new and volatile and growing very, very quickly, especially, when the pandemic happened and all that stimulus was kind of released into the economy, we saw a lot of bubbles pop up, and we saw meme stocks shoot up, and we saw the crypto companies take off, and a lot of that now, that liquidity is draining out, and some people have lost their life savings trusting the wrong companies and people. So I always urge people to be very careful. Don't trust, verify.
Now, what's interesting about that is that people have a funny way of trusting stories, right? And putting in the podcast name Coin Stories, I think, is a valid way of not just getting attention, but it is the way you educate. You educate through stories. But the problem, of course, is that stories can be fictional, right? And I say that because I've done a lot of studies on psychology, behavioral finance. There's some interesting studies that show, for example, that if you had the same set of facts across two different legal cases with the same exact type of people or whoever would be the defendant, the lawyer that has the facts in the most strongest narrative is the one that ends up getting the verdict, while the same facts with a disjointed narrative tends to not, right? Even though it's the same facts. How do you separate out the fiction from the reality? Because I think part of being an influencer like you are and being a host is trying to real time tease out what's real and what's not.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. Stories are I think so fundamental to the way that we communicate as humans. And for me, the reason that my show was called that is because I was very curious about the backstories and origin stories of the people in the space that I was learning from. So going back to something I mentioned earlier, I really had no intention for this to become a full-time job for me. I was working as a journalist, and I was actually relatively satisfied with my last network position that I had. But I was so curious about Bitcoin, and I thought we have this really, really big problem, and that is prices around us going up, greater wealth disparity and wealth concentration. What causes it and what fixes it? And so for me, I started to have this thesis that Bitcoin through technology is actually the way to fix it. And I had to learn about it through all these books and other podcasts. And I was very curious about the people that were basically offering this content and writing these books and telling these stories. I was curious, how did they discover Bitcoin? What drew them to be curious about it? And why do they believe it's the solution? So for me, it was just about, who were these people that make up the Bitcoin space? How did they get into it and why do they believe in it? So I called it Coin Stories because it was basically a podcast about origin stories. And as it's evolved and I've had, guests come back on, now it's really more of the story of money and what is money and what is happening in our economy. And the story shifts, right? As liquidity changes, as certain politicians come into office, as votes happen, as crimes are uncovered, the story shifts and you have to be very fluid and always be asking questions. I mean, I listened back to some of my old episodes and some of the content is super evergreen and it's so crystallized. Oh, why this person believes in Bitcoin and some of these very fundamental, important philosophies that are central to the Bitcoin ecosystem. But then other things are, relate back to when we were at the height of money printing and stimulus. And so everything changes and you just have to, be on your toes because right now Bitcoin's rallying and in a couple weeks we could be, back in the high teens, which is very possible. And so I love following that though. And that's something I had to do as a news reporter is just constantly be responding to wherever the story is going and shifting.
Yeah, and I've made this point before. So I used to do the CNBC and Bloomberg rounds quite a bit. One time had hosted or co-hosted a show, and during the commercial break, this is like back in 2011, 2012, I asked the anchor on break, so how are ratings? And the anchor said, well, ratings correlate to the VIX. And I said to him, well, does that mean you have a hidden incentive to create a degree of fear? And then, of course, the commercials ended and we got back to going live. I say that because, I think everyone would agree that when things are exciting is when people pay attention. Things get exciting when things are volatile, both up and down. Have you seen any change in interest, change in downloads with what's happened over the last year and a half to Bitcoin, to the cryptocurrency space? Or is it still sort of a steady core audience that, independent of volatility, want to pay attention?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, my show has been steadily growing, even though we've hit a bear market. And I've actually spoken to other podcasters and content creators in the space who have said that their audience and engagement is sort of correlated with the cycle. So as the price goes up, there's more engagement. As the price comes down, there's a little bit less. But thankfully, my show has been growing. And I think because of the FTX blow up, there was a lot more attention and people seeking out information and trying to better understand what happened. So that actually, even though it took the price downward, it caused viewers and listeners to increase because people were just so curious what the heck happened since it was such a big blow up. So yeah, I one thing that I think is interesting though is when the price was running up to $60,000, and that was just around the time I actually left my job and officially went full time into the podcasting space and on my own. I had so many questions. The people in my life around me, my friends who are in various industries saying, what is this? How do I get in? Wanting to invest as it was reaching the all-time high. And now that it's, the price of Bitcoin in US dollar terms is a third of what it was, people are less curious and not asking me as much. And they think that, it's going to go down even further. So they're a little bit worried. So there's that psychological aspect of the FOMO where I don't know what it is, but the price goes up and everyone wants to hop on board. And when it's more technically affordable and has a lower cost basis, people are just waiting for it to maybe bottom even more. So it's, that's all human psychology, I guess. For me right now, this is a really great entry point. And I think it's so important to, on a daily basis, really educate people on the fact that, yes, Bitcoin has this high price, but you can buy, sats for $4. You can just buy fractions of Bitcoin and you could start to accumulate and sort of opt out of the current system. So I think it's important to get that message out because so many people still don't even know that you can buy portions of a Bitcoin.
It's good for a question who's got some great research himself. Good.
Yeah, you bring up a really important point, and it's something that I think about because it took me a while not only to understand Bitcoin and the network and the differences between Bitcoin and crypto, but also to get to that next level of feeling comfortable to self-custody. And, I have to admit, as someone who I think is very well versed in the space, every time I'm moving to cold storage, there's a little part of me that's just a little bit nervous, making sure I got every single letter, I accounted for everything. And it is a little bit scary. So I can see why it's very intimidating for, the average person who has their full-time job. They're worried about a million things. And now they're trying to become their own bank and they're worried about whether it's safe or not, because there is, when you have a bank account today in our traditional system and you have the FDIC insurance, you don't even think about it. I mean, right? You probably put more time into the kind of television you purchase as opposed to where you actually put your life savings in a bank. And so Bitcoin, I think that the industry is going to try to solve for that. And there are going to be some innovative companies in the space, including the Fedimints of the world, that are trying to devise solutions. Maybe, it's sort of, we say, not your keys, not your coins. Maybe it's not our keys, not our coins, right? These sort of federations where you have custody among a shared group of people. So I definitely think that this is a problem that the industry needs to solve and will solve. Me personally, I was intimidated by self-custody, but when you go down into it, it's really not that hard. It's probably, I like to sometimes equate it to when I was 16 or 17 getting my license, I was kind of afraid of driving a car, right? You're like, oh my gosh, this is a big responsibility. But once you get behind the wheel, it's actually not that difficult and you get the hang of it really quickly. And these companies, the cold storage wallets, a lot of them do a great job basically showing you a how-to guide of how to do it. And there are great people, like someone in this room right now, BTC Sessions, does great tutorials of how to put your money into cold storage and do it in a safe way. There are so many options out there. And, I hate to say this, but personal responsibility is super important. If you're going to take custody, you have to be very, very careful. And for me, it was important to do that because I don't trust exchanges. I really don't. Once you have a centralized ledger or a company, it does introduce that vulnerability and that point of failure that I want to avoid. I trust myself more than any of these companies and CEOs at the end of the day. And there are good actors and there are going to be bad actors, no matter what industry you're in. So for me, I like self-custody is the best, but then I look at someone like my parents who I orange pilled and they don't feel comfortable with cold storage wallets. So I think that it's just, there's going to be more solutions that arise as the space evolves. And I think that it's going to be more of a personal choice, but I really caution people to be careful, especially with these big exchanges that have their native tokens and they have market makers and they may be trading against customers. They have onshore and offshore entities that operate in a very opaque way. I just say, be careful, do your homework. Don't trust, verify. And if you have the ability, do take custody of your Bitcoin. Right. And I do think that multi-sig is also the way to go. You don't want any central point of failure, even if you're talking about taking self-custody. So I just think this space is so incredible. And if you do have a question, if you're new, there are so many Bitcoiners who have been in it far longer, certainly than me, who you can go to and ask questions. And there are so many resources online. And so it does take time though. It really does take time, but you also want it to, right? I mean, if you're talking about preserving and storing your life savings in this immutable, this eternal way, then you do want to be careful about it, right? And I'm really inspired by the way that the industry is trying to address some of these issues for the folks out there who say, well, I obviously do want to invest, but I'm worried. I'm worried about the custody aspect of it. I'm worried that it's outside of the current system and that I would be responsible. And what if I lose these, the seed phrase? And so I think that these are valid questions. And I think it's something that the space is going to do well to address.
All right. So hold on. So you said it kind of quickly under your breath of the idea of those that want to put their life savings in Bitcoin. And I always go back to this point that I keep referencing, which is that what you own matters a lot less than how much you own of it. It's always about waiting, right? And the sequence of returns that might impact your lifestyle in the unknowable tomorrow. And I feel like this is something that is hard to really get to a nice, rational conversation around with a lot of the very loud voices in the Bitcoin community, in that it's almost presented as it's either all Bitcoin or it's all fiat. There's no in between. You're either a maximalist where you go 100% or you're going to be off zero at 1%. How do you think through the weighting question in the context of these stories, because the more seductive a story is, the more convincing it sounds, the more there's going to be a confidence level in waiting even more than one probably should.
Well, the way that someone saves is, I think, their private business. I think that some people have immediate huge purchases that they need to make, and others are planning more long term. And I think some of that has to do with age and their income streams. And so for that, I think it's a very personal matter. But really, I mean, at the heart of this, I'm trying to help build the future I want to see. And for me, that future is one with a form of money that can't be manipulated and can't be stolen from people in the form of inflation. I want to fight for a Bitcoin standard because to me, I see it as the only solution to this greater problem of our wealth being slowly eroded by the powers that be and our freedoms being eroded. And I do see that as this mission that's bigger than myself, and I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. I do believe in it, and I've put enough work into studying it that I do trust it. And that's my personal decision that I have invested most of what I am worth into Bitcoin because I've taken the time to really study the network and understand both the strengths and the obstacles ahead when it comes to adoption and regulation and all of that. And I believe in it, and I think that it will create a more accessible, equitable world. I want to be a part of a global economy that is based on value and competition and supply and demand that is based on real interest rates and prices that aren't manipulated. I want to see less government and more ingenuity and production and value from the people. And I think that that's what Bitcoin really empowers on a global level. And so, you kind of alluded earlier in the conversation to this idea that here in the West, we're sort of privileged, right? We've always had the 60-40 portfolio and everyone knows to kind of save for a rainy day. But in developing nations, Bitcoin is being used in real time to, subvert oppressive governments and to avoid way worse inflation than we're experiencing here with our CPI. And it's helping people in real time have a real currency that they can trust and rely on and be banked for maybe the first time. And I think that those two worlds will cross. We'll have, from store of value here to medium of exchange. And from there, people using it right now as a medium of exchange to be able to save for the first time in their lives. And I truly see this as just this incredible movement to have a more ethical, reliable form of money. And money is at the base layer of everything that we do as humans to transact and communicate value with one another. And so I think what better thing to be involved in than something that can improve upon that and hopefully bring more opportunity to people. Like, for me, it's about equal opportunity, not equal outcome. Well, the chips will fall as they may, as some people are more motivated and will work harder and want to be entrepreneurs and take more risk. Others don't want to. And so, but I think the system at large needs to be more fair and accessible. The one that we have right now just pools money with the people that have the first access to it and who already have a ton of money. And I don't like that. I think it's not a fair world that we live in right now.
By the way, contrary to some people's opinions on Twitter, I'm myself not anti-Bitcoin. I'm simply anti-narratives. I can see the value. I remember very well when I was presenting at a CFA chapter, I don't know, maybe 7 years ago, somebody had asked me off the cuff after my presentation what my thoughts were on Bitcoin. I made exactly your point, Natalie, that I can see it having tremendous value for countries that you don't have a banking system, where you've got to do microtransactions and where you don't have a wallet, you just have a phone, right? And there's unequivocally a use case there. I think that the dilemma that those that want to get involved in the space have, which I think is justified, is that it really is hard to separate out the narratives from the reality. So we can go through them, but all these narratives around inflation hedge, store of value, a lot of these things, I was very much against, only because I don't think that's the reason you should invest in something if there's no proven history around those concepts. So you mentioned it before, and I know you've been on this point too. It's really about debasement. What are from your vantage point, Natalie, what are the real reasons one should consider Bitcoin? Let's take away the stories and the kind of one-liners. Let's really kind of drill it down for the audience.
Yeah, so I actually want to credit Jeff Booth for something that I'm about to share, because I've had some really thoughtful conversations about him, and his book, The Price of Tomorrow, really made an impact on me about, again, it's not a Bitcoin book. It's really talking about where our economy is going. And the question that he posed to me when I asked him something along the lines of, how do you approach someone who's so skeptical, who says, why would I even consider this? Our current system has worked for however many, decades, and for so many countries. Why would I try to opt out of it? And his very simple question was, if technology is supposed to drive prices down, if there's supposed to be deflation, and if technology does achieve deflation in prices, we see the cost of everything from, mobile phones going down, TVs going down, then why do we see prices going up in the form of houses and your groceries, and your wages are not keeping up with that, right? So if technology is supposed to drive prices down, why are prices going up? And so then you start to ask that question of, well, how does the system actually work? Where does our money come from? Why are we going so much further into debt, and we're seeing, the price of real estate go up by 7, 10, 30% in some cities a year? We see the price of stocks completely outpace what the fundamentals of a company actually look like. And you start to say, well, why are those prices going up? We have technology, which is, causing us to produce more and make things cheaper. Where's that disparity? And the disparity is because we have a system where our government is financed through debt, and we're printing money, and that the system is completely manipulated. And so how sustainable is it? How sustainable is it for, younger generations to come in so indebted and have their taxes be higher and their burdens and obligations be higher, and they can't even afford a house because the wages of the jobs that they get out of college don't match up to the cost of living anymore. And so their parents have the wealth, and it's not being passed on in the form of production and value to younger generations. And so once you kind of think about that, you start to say, well, there's clearly a problem, right? The American dream is no longer as easy to achieve. And we're seeing other countries start to go off the sort of dollar dominance and the dollar system that we've been so privileged to enjoy in this country. And Bitcoin, to me, is the only solution that is technically and ethically sound when you dig into the network and the programming and the fact that it really has become so decentralized that it is bulletproof, and it would be so expensive to try to hack. You start to realize that there is actually a solution that has this grassroots movement. It is coming. It's not top down. It's bottom up. It is just growing throughout the world in an organic way. And you start to see a lot of hope that the future could actually be different, that the future could be full of abundance. And going back again to kind of Jeff Booth, what he talks about is, when there's abundance in money, there's scarcity everywhere else. Everyone's trying to, put their money into the real estate market. Everyone's, has to become a landlord. Or the world becomes, overly financialized. Everyone has to become a day trader on the side when they're just, a dentist 9 to 5, but can't afford an average life. And you start to say, well, now there's an option out of that system, and this technology is growing. And for me, that's why Bitcoin became so fascinating and so full of hope. Is I saw through technology a solution to really the most pervasive problem that we have, which is, instead of things getting easier as we get older and things getting cheaper, it's going the opposite way. And so Bitcoin, in the form of hard money, hopefully can change that. And we have lots of obstacles ahead. And I am picturing, the Bitcoin standard many decades from now. But I think it's, again, a future worth fighting for.
Let me real quick just reset the room for the remaining minutes here. Everybody, please make sure you follow Natalie Brunell and check out her podcast. I will have that says podcast under that Lead Lag Live banner soon enough. We'll go to.
You bring up some really interesting points, and you're right. The current system really does encourage moral hazards, and it sends money to the people who already, they have access to it because of how large they are. They're too big to fail. Everything's sort of backstopped by the Federal Reserve, and all of it is one credit card paying off another credit card, right, at the end of the day. And so we've lost our sort of global dominance in many ways, and the effects of the consequences are still trickling through, and we're not going to see the full extent of them for many decades. decades. And I do think that there is sort of a providence in when Bitcoin was invented and how it came to grow the way that it did, because we need it now more than ever. And like I mentioned earlier, it really is this powerful grassroots movement that starts with the people who need it the most. And one thing that, you made me think of in the comments you just made is the fact that people want to find both someone to blame and also a savior. As populism grows at the end of these long-term debt cycles, which we are in, people, form these silos and these groups and these troops and say it's that guy's fault. And we listen to these politicians who come in and say, well, it was those guys that did it, I'll fix it. Meanwhile, most of them have been in office for decades and have only benefited financially themselves at the expense of everybody else. And I think that there's this collective frustration and distrust. We have a horrible Congress approval rating. Nobody trusts what they say. There's now more and more distrust with traditional media. But you can understand it, right? Because people are saying, why are things getting harder in our country, in the superpower? We're supposed to have the most freedom. We're supposed to have the most opportunity. We're the beacon for other countries. And yet life is getting harder for the average person. And we're breaking into these groups and we're blaming it on left versus right, when the problem is so much deeper and actually more simple than that. It's our money. It's our financial system. Who gets access to it? It's not this guy's going to fix it because he waves a blue flag, or this guy's going to fix it because he waves a red flag. Unfortunately, most of them come in maybe with good intentions and then just fall in line. And they're part of the greater establishment that at the end of the day, socializes losses and privatizes gains. And so Bitcoin really does offer this solution that can fix some of these very core, deep-rooted issues. And it doesn't matter where you live, you can benefit from it. And you can hate Bitcoin and benefit from it. It's just a more fair system that provides accessibility to a financial system that isn't governed by rulers who can decide to change the rules on you mid-game. It's governed by rules and math. And I think there's something absolutely beautiful, inspiring about that.
By the way, I'm totally down with the asymmetry point. I've made that point before. Again, I still do to this day. Now I'm doing it on Instagram, where it's like if crypto space is up big or down big, I'll say store value, because that's always been a trigger for me as a narrative, just because it's about tail risk. But I'm with you on the asymmetry point. I mean, listen, the true definition of the market is not the S&P 500. It's every asset, which would include Bitcoin, right? So if you really are going to be an investor in the quote unquote market, we can debate about weightings, but the reality is exposure to everything is the way to go. Let me go to who's been waiting patiently. So, and by the way, Natalie, just to turn that into a question for you, I mean, I think this is an important point, which again goes against narratives that it's an easy transition. There's a lot more nuanced work that would need to be done for even the most fervent of maximalists to ultimately have their way. What are your thoughts on that aspect of this? Because you need to have some degree of centralization. I agree on the on-ramp side, but that has its own challenges, as we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it's an interesting conversation, because I actually just had an interview with Lynn Alden, who I think is one of the most brilliant macro analysts and Bitcoin voices in this space. And I asked her, what are the biggest threats to Bitcoin realistically over the next couple of years or the next decade? And she said it is cutting off potentially the on-ramps and the links to the traditional banking system that people use to convert their fiat into Bitcoin. And so there are hurdles, but at the same time, I'm inspired because there are circular economies that are forming around the world, and there are peer-to-peer marketplaces and ways that people access Bitcoin without a traditional system and without banking. And that's happening obviously more in the developing world and in other countries, as opposed to here, where people are used to their legacy bank account at Wells Fargo, Chase, whatever it may be, and then they convert from there. But I think, companies, websites like Local Bitcoins, and just sending money wallet peer to peer, that's the beauty of Bitcoin. That's what it was designed from the white paper to really empower. So I think we're going to see more of that. I think, everyone should be questioning the exchanges that they trust and the on-ramps, and there will be more regulatory capture that policymakers are going to try to impose on the industry. And they're going to use things like FTX as the perfect excuse to. I actually was on the phone with staff from a congressman's office, and they basically said that they were putting forth some legislation that really nothing to do with FTX and wouldn't prevent something like an FTX from happening, but it was relevant in the headlines. And so they were going to try to put forth this KYC bill that would basically, reduce privacy when it comes to non-custodial cold storage wallets. And I was sharing my opinion on why I think that's a very, very bad idea. So there will be hurdles ahead, but at the same time, Bitcoin facilitates and empowers the ability to obfuscate these intermediaries. And we're going to see that grow more and more rapidly in other countries where it's needed in real time. These peer-to-peer marketplaces, ways to exchange, ways to work and just have wallets using the Lightning Network send Bitcoin from one to another. And then I think that will translate over to the West as well. I'm ultimately very actually positive and bullish on regulation and what this space will look like from a clarity perspective and the policies around it, because it does encourage so much entrepreneurship, innovation, job creation, all of that infrastructure. But, we do have some short-term hurdles, especially when so many people confuse the space. They kind of equate the Bitcoin network and exchanging peer-to-peer value across the world and at lightning speed with this very opaque crypto industry that's largely offshore. So a lot of that really needs to be sorted out. And I think that will happen in the coming years. So I think that you're looking at the industry from a very narrow point of view, in the sense that right now there may be people in the West who see this as a new asset class that's emerging, and it's just a portion of their portfolio, and hopefully I can use this to save for the future. At the same time, there are communities in places from El Salvador to Guatemala to Nigeria that are using it in real time as their currency and as a way to escape 95% debasement of their currency, of their fiat, and to be able to transact in a way that is outside of the government or send money between family members that are in other nations. I mean, I'm about to publish an episode next week with a woman named Farida, who she's living in exile from Togo, and she's watched her currency just collapse in value because it's ultimately controlled by the French treasury. And she is helping Bitcoin adoption grow in several African regions. She travels around Africa where Bitcoin adoption is growing at the fastest rate of anywhere in the world. And people are surprised to learn that a lot more people than they thought have access to cell phones and are able to have Bitcoin wallets. And even when they're able to have cell phones that they're not smartphones, they can also transact in Bitcoin through these different methods that are being built in the space. And so I disagree with you in the sense that when I'm in this space, hearing stories of people actually using Bitcoin in real time to conduct all of their economic transactions and activity, we're probably more closed-minded and privileged here in the West, where we see it as more of something that we have in an account as a store of value, hoping it'll take off in the future as this major $500,000 of Bitcoin. Well, people are using it in real time in a lot of different places, and those stories are really important to tell because it does speak to that sense of why a peer-to-peer network is so important, why digital cash that is in an immutable form that cannot be confiscated, that cannot be manipulated, that cannot be inflated away from you, why it's so important today. And so I don't see the world that you do, but I'm looking for those other stories, I guess. Well, I definitely think that this is one of the reasons why people should be very careful trusting where they're getting their Bitcoin, because as we saw with FTX, that's exactly what they were doing, right? That they were basically printing IOUs and they didn't have the underlying asset, and ended up really hurting a lot of people that were completely unsuspecting in a very unregulated, opaque space. So, I mean, unfortunately, as of right now, because we don't have all of the clarity and a lot of these companies are offshore, it's incumbent upon the individual and the retail investor to be very careful, and why we advocate for things like self-custody, because unless you can verify that Bitcoin on the blockchain, you don't know if a company is maybe doing some nefarious activities behind the scenes with shell companies and commingling funds. But I try to just caution people, because I'm not going to trust a company like that. I'm going to take self-custody and verify that my Bitcoin are there because I have the keys I hold that power and I'm individually sovereign in that way. Whereas with another exchange, you are trusting a third party. And so there's inherent risk, there's an inherent point of failure. And we need to be better about educating people on that so that they feel comfortable, making the right decisions, taking self-custody, at least learning about it so that they're fully aware that if they're holding it in a hot wallet, it can be hacked. It can be unfortunately fall victim to something like paper IOUs. And right now, because of how early we are, it's incumbent upon people to take personal responsibility.
Folks, everybody, please make sure you follow Natalie here. We'll do a couple more questions, and then I've got a call to do before doing 37 more hour-long spaces for the rest of the day. Go ahead.
Yeah, one of the most interesting topics I like to talk about with people, especially the macro analysts in the space right now, is really the global currency shifts and the status of the US dollar. Obviously, stable coins come into play because, again, it is that sort of rail and people need access to digital dollars. And so I think it's really important that we understand the stable coin industry and we know that they are backed 1-to-1 if that's what if they say that that's the reality of their reserves. We need to be able to verify that. And that's the way that I think people are going to onboard. And I believe that in the future, we're going to see a situation where the dollar is the currency. For lots of countries, I think a lot of currencies will collapse into the dollar, and then there's going to be a digital dollar that people use maybe to transact, but Bitcoin will be the store of value. And again, we're far away from that, but at the same time, we're also seeing it happen in real time as this ecosystem grows and as people need access to the digital dollar. And the dollar is still far better when it comes to inflation than many other currencies around the world. Brought up the point, every fiat currency has gone to zero. So I think that the dollar will go last. It's still got a ways to go. But unfortunately, our policymakers have done a great job at really destroying the dominance that the US dollar has had. And now other countries are creating their own parallel systems. CBDCs will come into play, and thank God for something like Bitcoin because it doesn't have that sort of censorship and surveillance that comes with CBDCs. So I think we're going to see a world where slowly but surely we will have Bitcoin continue to grow, and then we will have the CBDCs and the central banks trying to control whatever they can in the form of these direct transfers and bank accounts that are tied directly to the central banks. And then we will also have the digital dollar, and the dollar will still have more strength than a lot of the fiat currencies out there, although it is waning because of some of the things that we've done and the sanctions and the inflating that people no longer trust our treasuries. So I think the next decade is certainly going to be one that's very, very interesting and volatile, because commodity has also come into play, right? You can't print energy, and all energy for so long was priced in dollars. But now these other systems are coming up. One of the most interesting things to read about is the MCBDC project and what China's trying to do. So, as nations start to diversify what they actually purchase oil in or price oil in, I think that's going to also have an impact. But for the near term, I think more people will be using a digital format of the dollar in the form of stable coins. I think Bitcoin adoption is going to grow. And I'm not sure if that totally answers your question, but I think this is, again, like in the short term, we can speculate, but in the long term, it's headed in this more secular direction.
By the way, I will say real quick, since you can't print Bitcoin, you can't print oil or commodities, I also cannot print time. So I have to wrap up on this space. Everybody, please make sure you follow Natalie Brunell. We'll try and do another space with her and a couple of other Bitcoin fans. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you for having me. Bye, everybody.